Hello everyone again. In the same spirit as yesterday, we are continuing to celebrate gender spaces and gender research. And this morning, we have a really special treat. Our wonderful PhD students, Amna, Ale, Vickie and Theresa, will present their research and show us how they ground their research in, in present moment, how they ground their research in their personal experience, but how that research kind of can resonate with many. So without further ado, I will pass you on to our wonderful students.
Hello. My actual PhD title is How Does the Convergence of Age and Gender Stereotypes Play Out for Women Working in the Fashion Industry During Menopause Transition? But after a conversation with supervisors, its working title at the moment is Why I Dress Like a Pattern Cutter. I'm a first-year PGR student. I started in October. My background is in the fashion industry and fashion education, working as a product developer, as a pattern cutter. So I don't have a background in feminist theory or anything like that. So at the moment, my level of knowledge is quite superficial. So please bear with me as I am sort of navigating my way around the linguistics of, the academic language is a challenge. There's a variety of things that I'm sort of navigating whilst I'm trying to formulate a cohesive argument. It feels like it's a timely conversation to be having. I've got three elements that I'm interested in looking at. I'm interested in looking at moving beyond just a biomedical model for the menopause. I'm interested in a broader understanding of fashion work and creative work, as a lot of existing narratives are about a work model that is more office-based. And I'm also interested in a narrative about gendered ageism and understanding wider experience of ageing that includes narratives from people with protected characteristics as well as a binary experience. At the moment, it feels like there is a conversation. Obviously, in the UK, we've had Davina. There is quite a lot of emergent conversations about menopause, and we are being better equipped to talk about it. But what I'm not seeing in the existing research that I've looked at, I think that there are quite a few gaps, and there are lived experiences that are missing from the overall picture. So if we are going to legislate effectively or write policy effectively or fine-tune it to fit specific organisations or career paths or industries, then we need a broader picture. In terms of the menopause itself, the definition is that it starts 12 months after your last period. And that is the general consensus, that it is a reproductive model, and once we can no longer get pregnant, that's the end of it. It obviously includes a raft of quite unpleasant side effects, which the NHS helpfully lists on their website. All sorts of things like hot flushes, memory loss, all the things that you'd expect. The issue with using a biomedical lens only is sort of has wider societal implications, really, because we're sort of presenting, firstly, we're presenting older women as past their usefulness. If we take a capitalist model where we're sort of saying that it's all about productivity, obviously, if you can no longer produce children, then you've passed your usefulness. It also doesn't include anybody else that fits outside that sort of gender norm. The research that I have encountered has been mainly quantitative, and I would say looking at the types of questions that are asked, they're generally closed questions, and they talk about symptoms that we already know exist medically. And so really it's a bit like an echo chamber where the information that's there just sort of responds to an existing narrative. There is research that is much more qualitative, and there is much more research out there now that is about lived experience. But again, particularly if it's to do with work, it's very focused on specific kinds of work. It's also focused on economic loss to do with a kind of culture of not wanting to talk about the menopause, not wanting to self-declare that you've got problems in the workplace because of your health, a raft of other things. Something like the Bupa said that around 900,000 women are known to have left the workplace because of menopause symptoms that they found impossible to manage. It didn't specify the duration of their research time, so I can't quantify the start and end of it. But that signifies that that's quite, the implications are quite big for industry in terms of a loss of skills and talent, and the impact of additional costs in retraining people to fill the gaps that more skilled labour force is leaving. The other issue that I've found in research is that because we do base it on a biomedical model, is that GPs are the gateway really to help in terms of HRT. So there's a commodification of wellness and female health there, but also because it isn't compulsory as part of medical training, not all GPs are able to articulate those conversations successfully with women. So if they can't do it, and we don't have the language in the public domain, obviously the conversations aren't going to take place. And if you expand that narrative out further, and you want to include the LGBTQ plus community, not only have they got this initial language barrier to begin with, but there's also additional challenges with additional social stigmatisation and a kind of general pervasive unwillingness on the part of society to see menopause as anything other than a kind of cisgender experience. I could only find one study that explicitly discussed that, and I could only find one other study so far, but it's early days, that actually was an experiential study that looked at the experiences of 12 lesbian couples who were going through menopause. So moving on to the fashion industry briefly. The manufacturing of fashion products relies on skilled labour. It offers livelihoods, supports valuable artisan traditions, and it inspires generations of creative communities all around the world. That's it at its absolute best. In the UK, it's worth an estimated 61 million per year, so that's kind of significant. The flip side, obviously, is its notoriously complex supply chains, which makes it quite tricky to research in any depth in terms of business structures and business practice. Obviously, it has a poor track record with workers' rights, and there are also significant equality and diversity issues that tend not to go beyond tokenism. So we also have to work with this assumption. I think people assume that fashion is a female space. it employs predominantly women. Over 70% of the workforce is female. However, that's not reflected in the boards of fashion companies. The biggest company, it was just announced by Reuters this morning, the biggest company is now LVMH, which is a Paris-based company, and they own people like Dior. And their reach is obviously global. And that puts Bernardino, who owns it, right at the top of the chain, making him probably the most influential man in fashion at the moment. It is a kind of top-down business structure, and within that structure there's only one female creative director and two female women sitting on the company's board. So that's not Dior itself, that's actually LVMH, and they own about 30 or 40 fashion brands. So all the top brands belong in one stable. So there's only two people on the board. That means that there's no other opinions being shared. Those two people are his daughters. So that, again, that restricts any alternative perspectives or cultures filtering in at the top of the chain. People tend to think about fashion as either from the designer or from the or they think about situations like Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. But actually, there is a whole raft in Europe of different sized businesses with different agendas, with different skill sets. And it is kind of like a spider's web of interlinking small businesses. With China's influence, China's effectively been shut to fashion production because of COVID for quite a long time now. It's due to reopen later in the year, but that has meant that industry has moved back into Europe, maybe temporarily, but that means that the cultural sensibilities that apply to a Eurocentric approach to fashion are impacting on everybody. The Business of Fashion report, which is like an insider journal, they have said that more diverse companies, including those run by women, are better able to attract and retain talent and better placed to target and serve more diverse customer markets. They found in a survey of 1,700 fashion companies of varying sizes across the US and Europe that in terms of gender, age, education and other factors, where those companies had the highest level of diversity, they were the most innovative in generating product, and that had meant 19% more revenue in sales. So there is an argument for that approach, which Elizabeth and Moss Cantor actually also sort of supports, I think, or reinforces, really. I read something about an idea that's called outside the building thinking, where it's much more about diverse communities being part of the decision-making process and achieving positive results. So there is a kind of demand for it. There's also new transparency requirements with a slew of European legislation that's about to impact the fashion industry. And I think this is why we've seen Dior make the strategic step of making very, very public recruitments with women, well, 3 women we're talking about, we're not talking about many, but it's very public in the fashion industry media. In terms of gendered ageing, obviously we know that it's a youth-centric industry. But I wanted to say something about the concept of creative labour, which is why I dress like a pattern cutter. It really links clothing with authority, knowledge and skill levels for working in a visual industry. Because it's a visual medium and it is driven by youth culture, it doesn't mean that you have to actually be young. But you must be perceived as young. So what they're really looking for is employees who have the wealth and knowledge of a 50-year-old woman but look like a 20-year-old. So there is this additional pressure to make you think about how you're perceived professionally in the industry. We're already subjected to unrealistic beauty standards, and so ideals of appearance are more extreme in the fashion industry. Because professional women in creative positions are in the business of creating style and beauty, there's a higher level of expectation for them to maintain their dress and appearance. It's not explicit, it's clearly there, and it stops you from getting jobs. If you turn up and you haven't adapted your appearance to suit your client's aesthetic or taste, you won't be employed. So you really have to think about how you convey your skills alongside the usual professionality when you meet and greet people. I'm going to use, will you shout at me for the time? I'm going to use intersectionality. At the moment, I've introduced 3 elements, but they're not actually separate. They intersect, and one influences the other, I kind of imagine it a bit like a stick of rock when you cut through it and you see all the stripes and all the elements inside it running all the way through. It feels a bit like that. So that will be my approach for now, will be to look at the interconnectedness of these elements, and this is what my average day looks like. I do everything 3-dimensionally. I get a big bit of fabric and I have a mannequin, and sometimes I get a design and sometimes I free drape. People pay me to do that and then I go home again. This is generally what my working day would look like. The 3 M's, it's actually a paper called In Tackling Taboo Topics, a review of the 3 M's in working women's lives by Grandy and all. And it talks about how the 3 M's, which are menstruation, maternity and menopause, intersect with career stages and how one influences the other based on their work cultures. And I thought about that and thought I would apply it to my own career path. So it's kind of a longitudinal look, if you like, at my career. So, for example, hiding menstrual discomfort in my early design jobs. This was particularly tricky as a graduate in 1990 because as the last person in and the thinnest at the time, I spent most of my first year in industry in my bra and knickers trying on calico toiles while people made adjustments on me. Not because they thought that I looked like a professional thin person or a model, but simply because it meant they didn't have to pay for a fit model and they didn't have to bring someone who did do that professionally in. This is a practice that is still really, really prevalent today. Everywhere that I've worked in the last 10 years, we've had an intern that is just expected to strip off and try on toiles for us. I thought about my mid-career in 2000s when I was dressing to conceal a baby bump because I was worried that as a freelance pregnant woman, my clients wouldn't rebook me. I also then had to contend with leaky breasts with a breast pump, pumping in the loos because there was no designated spaces after the baby was born. I didn't feel like I could mention it. And in 2017, I was brazening out the indignity of a red blotchy face in managers' meetings as a department head and a menopausal lady. I did look at the NHS website at this point because I felt like I had no control over my own body. And when it said there were mood swings, mine only had one setting, and I was incandescent with rage the entire time. I called everybody out on everything. What you cultivate in industry is a thing called a fashion face, and everybody does kind of talk about it. Men have it, women have it, gay men have it, my trans peers have it. And it's when you watch practices that are not really socially acceptable, but because time is money and you feel the pressure of it, you keep your mouth shut. And I had cultivated this over 30 odd years, and then I arrived at menopause, and this socially conditioned mechanism that had been effective all this time, suddenly I couldn't control it anymore. And I was angry all the time. And that obviously made it really quite challenging. In Haggitude, Sharon Blackie talks about how menopause tortures taboos and challenges everything. And I do kind of understand that. It sort of became a catalyst for leaving my job, sort of making me a statistic, really. I had done everything I could think of to change my work situation. I'd reduced my hours. I had duplicate outfits in case of flooding or anything like that, where my periods were heavy. I had allowed myself to be the butt of jokes because I forgot stuff. I'd even bullied the caretakers into giving me control over the thermostat in the studio. So I really had no option left but to leave, and it made me think about how many other women were in that position. Gendering. I can't talk about fashion and not say something about it. I'm reading Butler at the moment. I really am engaged with the idea that gender is a performative thing, and in our society, obviously, it's a binary one of male and female, and it is borne out so totally in a fashion workshop. These are the mannequins that I generally work on, with the man on the left and the ladies on the right. They are developed through years of research with adjustments so that they are supposed to represent the mean physique of men and women. The reality is that you end up with something that doesn't really represent anybody quite. At the moment, in industry, there's nothing in between those binary representations of the body. So that is obviously problematic in the development of clothing, particularly where we've got an industry where one of the most emergent trends at the moment from Gen Z is the need for genderless clothing. So, am I done? Okay, so I'll finish it there.
Good morning. I'm Alessandra, and I am a first-year PhD student. My research is focusing in a particular kind of organization, the space industry organization. And I have chosen to focus on the enactment of the gender identities within this industry. And I've chosen the feminist new materialism, the critical posthumanism, and Butler's theory of performativity to doing so because I felt that these theories resonate with me and with my way to see the world. And I want to go with you and see that together the evolution of the space flight in a temporal way, starting from the beginning, the Cold War, until now. And I want to see with you this exciting adventure of space, as Kennedy said, from a background point of view, we can say even an objective point of view, and it is the women's point of view. And since the beginning, space race has discursively constructed the idea of space as a kind of final frontier, ready to be domesticated and conquered. And in a recent interview, Simonetta Di Pippo, which is the former director of the European Space Agency human spaceflight, defines space as the province, the district of the humanity. And obviously, this conquered needs a special champion of the human race. We can also say a kind of Übermensch, which is the astronaut. And obviously, the astronaut is a man. Specifically, is a white, cis, able-bodied man. And it is a perfect example of fortified masculinity. And he's basically the one with all the right stuff. Risk management skills. He's able to control his body in really stressful situations. And he's always able to assert his control over the technology involved in the space race. And it is not coincident that NASA at the moment that still have the Vitruvian man embodied in their uniform. And it is also completely devoted to the space exploration. Dottie Duke, for example, talking about her husband, the astronaut Charlie Duke, once said, "My husband was a complete workaholic. The space program was all he thought about." But obviously, even the Soviet Union has its proper masculine hero, which is the cosmonaut. Gagarin, for example, embodies all the manly virtues. He is a cosmonaut, but also a charismatic military officer and a really smart diplomat. However, the reality is that he wasn't selected because of any particular skill in the flight desk, but because he was basically straight out from the Soviet casting. He was a handsome young military officer with a bright smile. However, while everyone, the press, the space program authorities perpetuate this Gagarin myth, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman launched in space in 1963, experienced a really different treatment. For example, she wasn't allowed at all to engage any kind of political discussion. When the Western press talk about her, it doesn't focus at all on her working credentials, but describe her as a very fashionable woman with a really fashionable blue wooden suit and white shoes with spike heels. Even Gagarin, when talk about her fellow colleague, refers to her as a wonderful girl with a special unobtrusive feminine beauty. A part of Tereshkova, where are women during this exciting adventure of space? Obviously, they are in the background, and they basically are the marginalized and rejected order. They can be the 7 brave women behind the astronauts, and their duty is to relieve them from any kind of distraction, and in the same time, offer to the nation gaze their perfect houses, perfect children, and perfect smiles, as you can see from this picture. They might even work for NASA, but they are always in the shadow. They can be the office girls or human computers. However, they were just exceptions, as NASA wasn't exactly the place where, quoting Charles Bingham, a NASA employee, where minorities and women would normally turn as a first opportunity for a job. And if you want to read something more about that, my wonderful supervisor, Stephanie Ruel, wrote a couple of articles about it. However, the reason behind this is that the aerospace program is too risky for women. They are too emotional and sensitive to manage high-risk situations, and basically their place is at home raising the children. And we can understand it looking at the words of John Glenn that said that it is just a fact that the men go off and fight the wars and fly airplanes and come back. The fact that women are not in the field is a fact of our social order. It might be undesirable. However, despite the strong tendencies to preserve this patriarchal order, others did actually try to resist and change the status quo. Because women want to be a part of the space exploration and they want to be finally able to decide for themselves. And in 1962, a group of private female pilots, the First Lady Astronauts trainees, started an official training program. And their performances are not just excellent, but in some cases are even superior to those to their male counterparts. However, during a congressional examination, they are still considered physically and psychologically unsuitable for spaceflight. And even the flight's best pilot, Geraldine Cobb, or the so-called fetching ponytail blonde from Oklahoma City, there is really a focus on women's bodies, as we can see, is barred from the spaceflight. And to summarize the NASA position towards women's spaceflight, we can see how the Associate Director of Men and Space Center, Williams, commented Tereshkova's launch. He said, "There is no reason why Russia shouldn't orbit a woman. We could do the same. We have orbited a chimpanzee with an automatic system, for example." So we have to wait until the 1963 to see Sally Ride as the first female American astronaut launched in space. And for the European Space Agency, we have to wait until 2001. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes with you to read an extract of the first interview to Sally Ride. "Do you cry when things go wrong during a flight simulation?" asked the reporter. "No. I think I respond the same way that men respond." Another reporter asked her two questions. The first, whether she planned to become a mother after her flight. After answering the second, Wright said, "You'll notice that I didn't answer your first question." And if we think about the recent discussion about how Cristoforetti was able to perform her mother's beauties while she was in her space missions, we can see that things hasn't changed at all. And today is space, quoting NASA, available for everyone. As we can see from this data, the space industry still privileges male bodies. For example, only the 10% of NASA astronauts are women. The European Space Agency top management sees only 9% of female employees. And a recent study from Piccialli and other authors analyzed 10 European Space Agency solar system missions to see the participation of women on them. And their participation was between 4 and 25%, but in many missions they were completely absent. Only 60 women have flown into space to a total of 560 people. In the European Space Agency astronaut corps, we've got only one women beyond the active members, which is Samantha Cristoforetti. And the last European Space Agency's recruitment initiative sees 17 new astronauts selected, and we've got 8 white women and 1 white man with a disability. We can say that spaceflight is still an organization designed by men and for men, and men and women experience it through gendered disadvantages that are practical and embodied. In theory, the performance is the only thing that matters in this kind of organization, but in practice, space industry is still structurally, culturally, and intrinsically masculine, and it still reproduces an asymmetrical and gendered distribution of privilege and power. They may use token women as a kind of evidence of gender equality, but in reality, women have still to survive to an hyper-masculine dominated work environment, creating different careers, opportunities, and outcomes for men and women. Basically, if you are a woman, you can comply with it and, let's say, work as a man, stay cool and freeze your eggs, or you can try to resist it. I strongly believe that research can and should be a powerful tool in promoting gender equality and the respect of the other, and the neglected in our still patriarchal society. And if we focus on the astronaut, we can see how their gendered working identity is performed within a normative framework of discourses, cultural practices, and power relations. Since the beginning, we have seen how not only the organizations involved in space exploration, such as NASA, European Space Agency, and so on, but also the press, the private organizations that are colonizing the space industry, thanks to Elon Musk, for example, or Bezos, and even the cultural and expectations from normal people still keep defining the legitimate ways to be and perform a femininity or a masculinity in the space organization. If we want just an example of it, we can see all the comments about Samantha Cristoforetti is not a good enough mother, or how she appeared to the press. And the astronaut performs their gender identities in a never settled repetition of acts, trying to enact these suitable and settable ways to be a man or a woman involved in a space race, in a desire of recognition, and trying to avoid the unacceptable and undesirable ones, because let's say that no one wants to be the objective of an organization. However, especially if we focus on the space organizations, we can see that not only the human beings, but also the materiality significantly matters in shaping identities and bodies. Technologies, facilities, equipment affect the disabling of gendered bodies. Cristoforetti, for example, during an interview about her last mission of space, told us about all the difficulties experiences because of the rigidity and the size of her spacesuit. And bodies, technologies, equipment, facilities are not something separated, but they are always entangled, and they create something more from a sum of the parts. They are actually entangled, creating the phenomenon astronaut, which is made of flesh, technologies, discursive practices, and artifacts. And this is the reason why I can say that the astronaut is basically a cyborg, and a human and non-human fluid becoming. And this is the reason why in my research I will draw from Butler's theory of performativity, feminist new materialism, and critical posthumanism, that are, from my point of view, really powerful theories allowing us to explore how gendered astronauts perform their gender identities and embracing or resisting the normative categories circulating within the space industry, defining identities but also bodies. But I will focus also on the materiality which is entangled with our gendered working bodies, perpetuating and or resisting to inequalities. I have chosen a defective methodology in doing so. Working and thinking with Butler, Ballard, and Braidotti means for me to embrace the fact that we can't conceive the existence as an individual affair, because we are always entangled and involved with the other human and no-human identities. And through this defective methodology, I will be untangled myself with the phenomenon inquired. I will see how the connections, the boundaries will emerge from this phenomenon, and I will see all the different reconfigurations of the world. And I think that this is really important, because these theories, this way to think, is a way to finally question all the colonialist anthropocentric logic of exploitation and subjectivations that still dominate our way of living and conceiving the other, that can be the other genders, the other materialities, but also the other planets. Braidotti said that basically we are assisting to the most important colonization project since 500 years ago. And we can't perpetuate all the logics of patriarchal society, all the logic of exploitation of the other that still are embedded in our society. We need to basically try to open a path to embrace reality, embrace alterity, and live and try to live in a responsible and committed way. And I think that this is even there is an hope in my project to try to reimagine a future which is more sustainable and try to reimagine not only our existence in our planet, but even the space exploration. And we may abandon the utter disregard that we are showing to our planet and everyone which is not conformed in this kind of society. And I just want to show you that even now there are possibilities to imagine the space exploration, the space flight in a more equitable and sustainable way. This is, for example, a project, the Aurelia Institute, which is led by women, and they are trying to see the disabilities of bodies in a kind of different way, because in space, basically all the bodies are disabled. And I just want to leave with this.
Hi everyone, and good morning. Well, I'm not going to be as extensive, like you have been quite thorough with your research. So I'm just gonna, talk about a couple of things about my research, but my life as well here in the UK. But my research basically is about exploring the work experiences of women of color who are working in care homes during COVID-19. And while I was doing it and I was collecting my data, there was this theme about bordering, or how some bodies are allowed and conditioned to be here and on what terms. So this was, I had a lot of conversations about this with these women, and that informed this specific presentation. But of course, my thesis is still in progress, and I'm still, analyzing my data, so it's just a component of it. But if you look at this, image, there are a couple of images here. So if you look at the Labour Party, which is supposed to be progressive, or at least many people think they are progressive, and they talk about control on immigration and immigrants quite a few times. Tories talk about immigrants, so it's like in the UK, specifically in post-Brexit and post-Brexit times, the conversations about immigration is always here. And now even in the recent times after Rishi Sunak was elected, I started hearing that they're talking about a crackdown on foreign students in the UK because the students are, so problematic. They are crowding the housing, NHS services. So they always find a foreigner to blame in one way or the other. But that's just a context, really, like in which context this research was being conducted. And in terms of when we talk about bordering, it's usually we think about a line at the at the outside of the country, like it's a physical manifestation that a border is there. But sometimes borders can be very metaphorical in everyday life. How you exclude and include people. And basically this definition which I'm talking about is from Yuval Davis' work when she talks about that how when society is being made responsible to check migrant bodies, where they move, how they move, why they are moving. So for instance, in the UK, if you go and if you want to rent a property, your landlord and landlady is responsible to check whether you have a right to rent or not. Similarly, if you go to NHS, they look for at your status, to your ID as well. And so these internal borders are created through recurrent organizational practices. We are checking your right to be here, your right to work. And I think is at multiple levels, even in universities, they are responsible to have a monitoring on your body, on your movement, where you are and how you are, and for how long you're going to be here. So it's very interesting that sometimes these everyday bordering can create orders and hierarchies, how people, can have some jobs. For instance, in my case, I cannot work in the UK full-time. I can only work for 20 hours, per week. And when I was actually experiencing quite a few difficulties in the finances recently as well, because I just cannot, when I have the skill set and everything, but I cannot do it. So it's more like when external borders are being outsourced to internal society. And then societies, different service providers, institutions, organizations, they are responsible to make sure that they will carry out these external borders internally too. So in this context, I was looking at, and of course, like some foreigners are more foreigners than others, as Tudor will say, which means that migration is quite racialized too. If you look at some people, specifically brown and black bodies in here, there is always a question whether do they belong here. Like I was looking at one of the video about Rishi Sunak when he got elected, and this guy he was calling this presenters saying, how can he be prime minister? He is brown. And she's like, yeah, but he's British. Like, no, he's not British. He's brown. So it means that you need to have a certain color. To have that sort of belonging in this context specifically. So which is very interesting. And when these women, in my case, women of color, when they arrive in these spaces are not neutral already. These spaces are quite pitted against them in many ways. And of course they resist, of course they have agency, and of course they come up with coping strategies. But having said that, the system is still pretty much stacked against them in many ways. And as Fenu talks about a line of humanity where some humans are about on that line, where they are considered as people, full people with labor rights, with protections, and people who are below that line. And they don't have any of those protections. And then as I talked about actually the zones of being and zones of non-being as well. So those zones of non-being are people who are actually living in zones of being where people have protections, but they are racialized minorities and they don't have any protections which state offers to other things. So in that with that understanding, I say there are very clear intersections between migration and racialization as well, and how we see some people they don't even in my research. There were some women who had such a status in the UK, and one of them, she was talking about that whenever I go and ask for some service provider to help me, they always ask me, show me your paper. Do you have your paper? And they always come up with this question, do you have your papers? the shows. So it never goes away, even when they have their, when they get the passports as well. So in this way, my research is, is grounded. And of course, I talk about the bordering in my own life as a student, and there's a consistent sense precarity of place that you can be here, but then you cannot be here. And when specifically you have loved people here, you are very attached with some people here, still like you can never show how long you're gonna be here. So in this sense, I'll say it's bordering, and it actually produces precarity as well. And in terms of my research, I have conducted interviews with 40 women in different care homes and care agencies. And these bordering practices, such as they consistently remind you that you are being sponsored, you're on a visa, it produces a very kind of a precarious subject in these institutional, places. And as Butler says, that precarity is usually induced by socioeconomic arrangements as well. And it's definitely, precarity is not, because most of the research on precarity was about that, or it's a subject, but of course precarity has intersectionality too, where your race, gender, class, they intersect and create different outcomes for different people. So in terms of my research context, it's a double bind of time. You are, like on a temporary leave or indefinite leave to remain, but you can still be sent back. Windrush scandal is a testimony to it, that you never belong here, or for them at least. And at the very same time, the labor processes within care homes, how is time managed, is consistent pressure to produce the labor, and to deal with bodies. So I think it's a double bind. You are on a ticking clock of being sent back or not. And then on a ticking clock in organizational practices that you have limited time, you have to handle these many bodies when you're actually doing a quite emotional work. And in one of my interviews, this woman was talking about that in one night during COVID-19, she attended 35 patients in one night. And it's this intense that at times, if you don't do your job, you are reminded again and again that we are sponsoring you. Remember, we have the right to send you back if you want. So just do whatever we're asking you to do. So it's quite interesting in this way. So I think precarity in my context is quite, there are different levels and how it's produced at the level of immigration laws, then at the level of organizational practices. So it's quite layered. And then the labor processes within care homes is interesting. So in terms of embodied precarity, I'll say, as I said, body, it has a very significant place in care work, because you're using your body to perform emotional labor as well as physical labor as well to do these jobs. And I was speaking to one of my participants, and she was, she didn't have her papers. She was undocumented, and she told me, like, for last 1 month when I was conducting my interview with her, that she has worked 300 hours in 1 month, and she was being paid only £3 per hour, just because she doesn't have papers. And how state, creates categories of people, even within migrants, I'll say, across your status, your citizenship, your race even. So it's very interesting at many levels. And then there's a lot of abuse which happens. Of course, these women, they have, as I earlier said, they have agency, they have a lot of coping strategies. For instance, some of them, they use humor to contest. One of my participants was saying that one of her clients said to her that you're a monkey. And she said, yes, we are all monkeys here. And we are going to dance. And, we're going to be here. So we're going to take care of you. So, we're not going to go away. So I think this is like briefly my research is about, and how it's been, I have been analyzing my research. So I think borders are external, but they're internal too. And I think we need to reflect where we can help, because I think as service providers, as I said, institutions, they all carry out these practices, and they are not just there guess that's it. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to go straight in. I think that's okay. I'm Vickie, and I'm in the final year of my PhD researching endometriosis in the workplace and menstrual policy. And today I wanted to share some of my findings around time. So my work is grounded in feminist, queer, and disability theories of time. And my interest is in how they open up new life narratives, political identities, and alternative relations to time and space for people working with the condition. And I call this endo time. I'll refer to endometriosis as endo from here on out, just for ease. So endo time, I believe, is a radical way of being in the world, diverging from not only normative and ableist time, but also socially normative life stages and neoliberal logics of labour. So in the time that we have together today, I'm going to focus on just some of the temporalities that are collected under endo time, that of crip and pacing time, waiting and weighted time, sick and precarious time, but also resistant time. I draw mainly from the work of feminist, queer and crip theorist Alison Kaffer and Kaffer's reading of Halberstam's Queer Temporalities. So thinking about endo and time, the condition is routinely conceptualized in temporal terms. The medical sphere in particular defines endometriosis through orientations in and through time, such as chronic pain, fluctuating symptoms, constant fatigue, irregular periods, and cyclical treatments. They label the condition in terms of duration and project futures of illness and disability. And in thinking about endo time differently, I was really moved by the writing of Johanna Hedver in Sick Woman Theory. Johanna points to using a different language to Western medical language, that of Native American Cree language, where the possessive noun and verb are structured differently than in English. In Cree, instead of saying I am sick, one says the sickness has come to me. And I love this because although endometriosis is chronic, for me, this really captures the temporal shifts and embodied precarity of the condition. Endo comes to everyone differently and differently at different points in time. There really is no uniform experience, no predictability, no notice of the length or severity of a flare-up. It truly alters one's relationship in, to, and through time. So I'm going to begin by sharing how and when endo came to me, and also some of the other 21 cis women who shared their time with me across interviews and diary entries. And during our time together, these women were aged between 19 to 49 and working with endo in the UK across 19 different industries. These included construction to health and social care, the armed forces to retail, and government to marketing and technology sectors. So a very wide breadth. Before I go any further, let me first just explain what endometriosis is. So it's a condition where tissue resembling the lining of the womb grows outside of its home. It can grow onto the ovaries, the bladder, bowel, and in very extreme cases has also been found on the chest and the brain. Each month when these rogue tissue and cells break down and bleed, they're trapped, leading to inflammation, scar tissue, and adhesions. And endo can affect anyone assigned female at birth. So endo came to me when I was 11 with a series of fainting episodes, monstrous pain and bleeding, all whilst on holiday with my family. And I can assure you, starting your period sharing caravan bunk beds with your teenage brother is really not very fun. And endo now comes to me in the only way that I can describe it to you, as if an army of bayonets are attacking my pelvis, and the only relief is to sink down into this squat position and just wait for the slow drawing of the knife to subside across my bowel and intestines. And the endo pain and fatigue that follows this consistently makes it hard to work consistently. Endo came to Iris, a participant in the study, in frequent flare-ups that are consistent for hours and sometimes days. She talks of feeling bloated constantly, her fatigue going through the roof, and finding it really difficult to do anything apart from stay in bed. It comes to Erin in her spine, affecting her whole nervous system and the ability to walk, drive, or commute to work. And it came to Poppy as a series of misdiagnoses over 10 years, including being referred to psychiatry. Meanwhile, the adhesions from endometriosis had webbed across all of her organs. And believing it was all in her head, she carried on working, she pushed through, and eventually had to take 55 days of sick leave in 1 year. And I share these experiences because although I'd like to hope we've moved on in time from that centuries-old myth that the womb was a nomadic entity wandering around the body causing hysteria and distress, or that endo is just a bad period, we haven't moved far enough. Bodies associated with femininities and the experiences of these people are routinely dismissed. Medicine is androcentric, with the white male body taken as the norm, whilst other bodies are judged as abnormal. And this medical bias is further compounded by race and can lead to long-lasting damage to the body. People's experience in the medical setting is also mirrored in the workplace. Such bodies are delegitimized, disregarded, and socially constructed as problematic in the labour market. And just like in the medical setting, in an organisational context, we haven't moved far enough, if really at all, in acknowledging or addressing these non-normative temporalities that exist with chronic health conditions like endometriosis. And here I want to take just a second further to define endometriosis. So I define the condition, especially in an organisational context, as social and disabling. My understanding of endo is not one as a disability, although it can and often does meet all the criteria of a disability under the UK Equality Act. Instead, I believe people working with endo are disabled by the cultural and structural barriers in their environment, such as the pace of working life guided by normative temporalities, for example. Crip time offers a new way of thinking about and understanding non-normative temporalities, and this radically different way of being in the world. For people with endo, crip time involves an awareness that they might need more time to accomplish something or to arrive somewhere. For example, this need for extra time for Harriet is the result of a symptomatic night, making it difficult to get out of bed for work the next morning. For Layla, it's waiting for the spaced out side effect of pain relief medication to subside so she can travel to work. And this nods to Sharona Franklin's crip clock pictured here, so where time is marked out by a medication schedule rather than hours. For Hanny, it's the time spent cleaning up blood from bleeding through on a train station chair and managing the ableist encounter with someone who looked at her like she was disgusting for it. For Isabel, it's the brain fog that prevents her from concentrating. And for Iris, it's the time taken up in fear of using a disabled toilet and being questioned for it in an ableist interaction because her disability is invisible. Crip time then is not just about how one moves from space to space in time, but the ableist barriers which one has little to no control over. It's the need for flexible time and reimagining our expectations of what can and how things should happen in time. It's an understanding of time that diverges from this normative ableist time and unravels the social construction of ability. It's a departure from conventional time and scheduling to create individual life rhythms around flexible pacing strategies. And for participants, pacing was vital in being able to manage working life alongside endometriosis. It becomes this self-management strategy for activity and against the worsening symptoms that too much activity brings. And too much activity is testament to the normative pace of performance that's physically constructed and socially organized around the healthy cis male body, a construction that ignores the body with debility and neglects to incorporate what these people need to meaningfully participate within society. However, on the flip side, there's also pressure in pacing. Prevailing societal beliefs establish that if pacing is done well, if you manage yourself well, that you can cure yourself. And this compulsory attention to cure is what CAFA calls curative time. However, in the chronic time of endo, where there isn't a cure, the chronic is ignored here. It doesn't have a place in or through time. Pacing well and performing well then also means making illness more invisible than it already is to others. One then doesn't have a place in or through time in their full political identity. And this is the tension between correct management versus the trauma of not being seen. Nowhere is the trauma of not being seen more potent than in the medical setting for endo. On average, it can take between 8 to 12 years to receive a diagnosis. Waiting time then is the time of undiagnosis. CAFRA explains this as the shuttling between specialists, the repeated refusal of care and services, the constant denial of one's experience, the slow exacerbation of one's symptoms, and the years without recognition or diagnosis, the waiting. It's time spent with many repeated attempts and failed attempts at diagnosis, and living without proof of one's suffering. Waiting time then can quickly also transform into the heavy weight of time. The weight of not having written evidence to prove sick days, to access support and address temporal bullying in the workplace. And the weight of time is also not having a regular fixed status, which creates a non-citizenship relationship with the state. And this also can't be divorced from its economic effects either, like access to benefits, for example. Another participant, Rose, was in and out of hospital for a period of 3 months in her diagnosis journey. And without any financial support to pay rent or other bills, she nearly ended up out in the street. Diagnosis then can come as a relief, but it also confirms the irregularity of the body against not only normative time expectations, but also the normative life cycle, which can add a different weight to time. For example, a person's life with endo may not develop along a heteronormative life course. Significant life stages may be delayed, accelerated, or never reached at all. Pain, for example, may delay or prevent someone from completing an education. Fertility issues may prioritize starting a family over marriage. Intimacy issues may end a relationship in divorce. The absence of wanted children may evoke an ableist judgment that someone has focused too much time on their career. Medical treatments may induce the menopause noticeably early, and accumulated surgeries and sick days may jeopardize this sought after, neatly polished and linear CV. Ellen Samuels argues that CRIP, and I would add queer time here as well, is time travel. Disability and illness have the power to extract us from linear progressive time with its normative life stages and cast us into a wormhole of backwards and forwards acceleration, jerky stops and starts, tedious intervals, and abrupt endings. Moving forwards and backwards in time, in and out of sick time, was a common experience of participants. Even after a diagnosis, this didn't always open a path for empathy or accommodations in the workplace due to a lack of awareness and supportive policy. If anything, participants felt caught between policies that didn't respond to their non-normative temporalities. For example, sickness policy assumes that you get sick, you take time out to rest, you recover, and you return fully to work. However, this doesn't always account for regular, irregular patterns of illness. Participants will regularly set goals to reduce their sickness days. What Iris says is like an amputee being asked to grow their arm back, impossible. On the other end of the scale is disability policy. And although people with debilitating endo can be classed as disabled, as mentioned earlier, there's a stigma that they aren't disabled regularly or consistently in the same way as a wheelchair user may be. Their symptoms and disability will always fluctuate in time. The regular irregularity of fluctuating symptoms constructs a body with endometriosis as precarious. I'm just going to try and play this video. So this is a performance about life. And for me, this performance is a reflection of what people with chronic illnesses experience moment to moment, hour to hour, rather than across a life course. Of course, all bodies are precarious to a certain extent, but some bodies are made more precarious than others in space and time. Participants spoke of often living in this type of anticipatory time with their embodied precarity, a type of time spent watching and analysing anything that might cause symptoms to appear, but also anticipating sick days, formal warnings, and losing their jobs. Performance, participation, and progression are all impacted in the labour market. For Hani, her embodied precarity made precarious work more appealing to her for the flexibility it offered. And for others like Thea, her embodied precarity meant she had to leave her passion and then spent years searching for other meaningful work. Halberstam argues here that within the life cycle of the Western human subject, long periods of stability are considered to be desirable, and people who live in rapid bursts are characterized as immature or even dangerous. And this was extremely clear through participants' experiences. They concealed their symptoms, often engaging in body work and blood work, working through pain or weekends and holidays just to simply make up lost time. Keeping up with the pace of performance and work meant that in many participants' lives, it decreased their energy for other life activities, upsetting this delicate balance of energy by which a person finds room for pleasure and social connections in their life. The embodied precarity of endo and this non-chronological temporality is viewed negatively by society and the labour market and impacts the ability to participate and be rewarded meaningfully within it. Working with endo then can be this self-sustainability sacrifice between balance and burnout, flexibility and a flare-up, or pleasure and productivity. However, reading participants' transcriptions, I was really struck by the regularity of various forms of resistance expressed in their lives, all towards self-sustainability. And this, what I call a type of resistant time. Participants resisted societal norms of remaining silent about a gendered health condition, one that closely is connected to menstruation and other abject bodily fluids. They shared their condition with a person at work. They printed out leaflets for their managers and colleagues about the condition. They wrote blogs about endo in a personal and professional context. And they put in requests for greater organisational awareness and support. And perhaps one of the greatest acts of resistance, because it's more characterised by society as being lazy or eccentric or unreliable, is to say no to normative and ableist demands. Normative resistance then was in the outright act of saying no to the request that comes in at 6:30, despite the consequences that will be attached to it for Robin. For Jasmine, it was quitting grind culture and working at home in her studio, where she is better able to honour her body by extending the time she takes to rest. And it's also realising one's agency against capitalism's temporal bullying. Hani puts flexible clauses in her contracts, choosing to work when and where is best for her body. She lets her corporeal wisdom guide her working life. And there are, of course, social, racial, economic, and class implications for who can resist and how and in what form. So just some final words from me then. So linking back to yesterday's discussion on hope as well. Deviations from any type of normative temporality or life cycle are forms of situational knowledge, the continuous embodied awareness of one's location in space and time, and the knowledge to respect and honour our bodies as well as the bodies of others can serve as a model for epistemic justice and more equitable futures, not only for people with endometriosis, but people working in non-normative temporalities more widely. Thank you.
Whilst we're waiting for people to ask their questions in the chat and to think of their own questions, I will abuse my sharing privileges and have this amazing chat with you. I love all of your researches. I love how you're kind of basing it in something that you have observed or experienced, but are trying to do something more with it. And I was particularly struck with all these bodies, disposable bodies in Amna's case, suspicious disposable, ornamental bodies in Ale's case, leaking bodies in, Theresa's way, of fragile bodies in Vickie's case. So there are all these bodies that misbehave. Women have been around for a long time. Have been working for a long time. So why are we so alien then? Why are our bodies so alien in work, do you think?
It's based on a male model, isn't it, of the normative worker where there are no problems.
In fashion, especially.
Of course, yeah, especially in fashion. Yeah, and it is predominantly a female workforce. So there's in the UK, we employ roughly about 800,000 people in fashion, not necessarily full-time, part-time, 0 hours contracts, things like that. And it's all based on that kind of there won't be any issues kind of environment. We don't really design for the functions of women's bodies. We it's decorative.
Yeah, decorative, like in your case, Ale, isn't it? Or ornamental.
Especially in space industry, men's bodies are the norm. They are the perfect model of human body. They are more suitable for space flight, and women's bodies have been analyzed, scrutinized from a biological and physiological point of view. In the literature review, if we focus on women's astronauts, we can find a lot of articles about other physiology changes after, during spaceflight. There are a lot of studies about how menstrual women perform during spaceflight. So women's bodies are always something. You've got the perfect body, which is men's body, and women's body are I don't want to say inferior, but more complicated. Yes, yes.
Biology, isn't that, Amna? These bodies are also defined in terms of their geography, in terms of their appearance, like in your research.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think because it's us versus them, usually the narrative, and in order to feel alienated, Marx, I think, never really touched on race as much as he should have. But of course, every scholar has
Or
some
gender.
sort of gender for here, of course. So I think in this case, their bodies are out of place for them. They're always elsewhere. They're always out of place, and they're not suitable to be there. But of course, as state requires those bodies, so it's a kind of I don't know, very oxymoronic kind of relationship, like which they want but they don't really want. Just they are not really sure, but they have to, and of course, as I said, most of these women, they have agencies as well, and there's a lot of resistance, as Vickie was talking about as well, within these sectors. They're not just there and being exploited. Of course, they have strategies such as humor, and in care homes, a lot of women, they are quite subject to various sort of biopolitics of how bodies should be cared for. So what they innovate in this, they come up with their own cultural background, and they say, you know what, he's like my grandfather, and I'm gonna bring my own culture in. I'm gonna take care of the way I take care of you. I'm not gonna go for what you're talking me. Like, so like they're quite There are quite contestations. Of course, they take a lot of risk while they do it. And of course, it's very interesting that someone who is being racist to you, you're still being very kind to them. It's I don't know, it's very empowering at the same time. But they have their own means and coping mechanisms too.
Yeah. So we rely on those bodies of those women care workers because we want to be cared for,
Yeah.
right? But they're also objectionable. So Vickie, in your case, we have these unreliable bodies, and they're quite unaccepted in the workplace. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think Theresa mentioned the term, so capitalism's kind of concept of usefulness, and usefulness is designed around this consistent regularity, always on, always available body, for another word. But it doesn't take in, the typical working week, for example, doesn't take into account embodied needs such as menstruation, menopause, maternity. So it's quite often difficult to always be on and always be available every single hour or every week on a traditional working calendar.
I mean, considering all of that, how we are perceived at workplaces, in different workplaces, can I just ask a very basic kind of question? What is the motivation for doing this research, and what is it that you're hoping to achieve, with your projects, with your PhD projects for women at workplaces? Who wants to take first?
I don't mind. I think for me, there is a definite. I feel like because I've left a well-paid job, put myself in quite a precarious position. I need to do something really constructive with that, but also because I'm older and my children are adults, I have less of those responsibilities. So I'm actually really well placed at this point. And it turns out, as I said, because part of my menopause is that I no longer can keep my mouth shut. It might as well all be channeled into something really constructive, with sort of constructive research that can perhaps inform future policy, but certainly it can be part of a conversation. And I feel like in my industry there isn't a conversation about something that is happening to probably at least 3/4 of the workforce, or is going to impact on the workforce at some point. And there is also, I think, because there's no conversation about it, there's very little advocacy from younger women as well. And I wouldn't like to think that going forwards in the future, my kids certainly are in their 20s. By the time they're in their 30s, I don't want this to still be a thing that people have to talk about. I just want it to be accepted and there's no discussion because everybody knows it's normal. So it's about normalising it, and I'm sort of pleased I've got an opportunity to be part of that process, I suppose.
And I'm glad you're doing it very much. Ale, what is your motivation?
I can say that history repeats itself, and during the Cold War, people were saying that there was this kind of soft masculinity crisis, and nowadays we can see exactly the same thing. We can see these kind of revanchist positions claiming that men have to be men and women have to stay on their places. I, for example, think about my country. I can see all the narratives about gender identities. You can't say gender identities because it is something wrong. And I also think that we are basically arriving in a point where space exploration is the future, because we are not lying when we say that our planet is dying, and our planet is dying because of our choices, because we are choosing to exploit everything which is different from us. We exploit, we subjugate other people. There are always more disposable bodies, more disposable others. And I think that we are basically going to do exactly the same out of space. NASA is planning a new moon settlement, so it's planning to send men and women, obviously because of reproductive practice, and we are basically seeing the perpetuation of a patriarchal order, a division between men and women, again, an exploitation of the other, the resources, the planet, everything. And I really think that I can at least contribute to do something more, to change, to conceive all the other in a more responsible and involved and ethical way. I hope so.
You say women belong to any space, but women also we tend to push women into certain spaces, like care work.
Yep.
So what is it that you are trying to do then for women care workers?
I think sometimes when I was conducting interviews with these women, because when you're a migrant, at times you don't have the community, or at least you're made to feel like you don't have the community, and there is a certain sense of loneliness in there. So when I was conducting interviews with my participants, there was a kind of a catharsis in those interviews. I used to ask them, so why did you decide to talk to me? Like, yeah, just to have a bit of a catharsis, really, like just to talk about this, you know. And I was like, I understand. And so I think my supervisor, Cynthia, knows that I have been quite emotional as well. I was quite affected when I was used to talk about, and there was a lot of emotional, not damage, but I'll say it's quite difficult at times to be a researcher in these kind of settings, because there's so many institutional requirements to be objective, but at the very same time, you're a woman too, and you feel all of it. So I think why I'm doing it now is to really present their stories in a way which justifies their efforts and whatever, and bridge a gap. In terms of intersectionality, still there's a lot of gap where women of color and the feminism itself, we need to speak more, we need to tell more of these stories. This is a motivation now. But why I started this PhD is a very funny story. So in 2019, in 2020, I was looking for a job. So I never intended to have a PhD. My partner actually was doing a PhD, so I look at her like, I'm not gonna do it. So I was looking for a job, and every time I used to, apply, they always ask me, oh, we don't have a sponsorship for you, sorry, we cannot sponsor you. And I was quite like overwhelmed at that time, because I was like, it's such a precarious existence, because my partner doesn't know what's gonna happen, and I'm gonna go back, and I didn't want to go back. He didn't want me to go back. So I come across a couple of opportunities, and this PhD sounded very closer to my heart, and I have a bit of experience as well in the industry, and I thought, okay, maybe I should apply for this. And then I got the position, and I was like, I'm a purely accidental PhD. I never had the intention, and even if I become some academic, that will always be an accidental academic. I never intend to become an academic, to be very honest. So
You now doing all the hard work of feminism and academic research. Well, I'm glad we tricked you. Vickie, any thoughts on your PhD and how you intend to change the world for women at workplaces?
Very similar to Amna as well, just to follow on from that. So I am definitely an accidental PhD student as well. I used to work in advertising, and I guess endo, just the way the design of the working week set up, the lack of awareness, just makes working with endo so much more difficult. Like, I loved working in advertising and I could do my job, but I couldn't do it in the way that I was supposed to do it. So I actually left. I'm a yoga teacher on the side, so I set up kind of these retreats for people with endometriosis. Realised, not shockingly now, that I wasn't the only one finding it difficult to work with endometriosis. And then there was one day I was sat in a gynae waiting room, and I looked around me, and no joke, there must have been about 50% to 75% of the people waiting sat there with their laptops. And I just thought, in what world, can we not even come to a medical appointment without feeling like we're missing out on time with work? And then that's where the idea for the PhD was born, and I'm hoping that my research will help put recommendations for policy together so that we can change the working week, hopefully, or just add more support in so people feel like they can go to an appointment without missing out on work, for example.
Thanks all. So we have a little bit of time for a question, either for all four of them or kind of a few individual ones. Okay, so first here and then Saoirse, if we have the time.
Yeah, this is just super quick from Nicoletta online. She actually asked two questions, but what Ali said in response to your last question has answered Nicoletta's question for Ali. Theresa, this is for you, my dear. Nicoletta just wants to know about your methodology. What kind of data you're going to collect and from whom?
Yeah, it will be qualitative because I want to collect sort of the lived experience of the menopause transition. I think most realistically to use my existing network of contacts in the industry and let it snowball from there is my plan. I also would like for it to be a kind of co-creational experience, if that's possible. So I guess that would mean that willing participants, maybe there's some kind of conversation that sets an agenda, that further down the line there's a further conversation with those participants that helps to shape it. So I'm kind of imagining that their engagement with me will start to shape the questioning and lead it further. As we're likely to be visual people, or we'll have some sort of creative skill sets, I am thinking of looking at a way where I can embed that into the way in which I ask the question and the environment in which the questions get asked, because there's something very sensory and soothing about workspaces with things like the heat of the press, it smells of hot calico, there's tactile qualities to it and sensory qualities that we kind of are at home with, I suppose. And I suppose also I am, in terms of who I'm asking, I'm looking for the people who are kind of already invisible because they don't fit the kind of shiny design end that is in the public eye, and they don't fit the fast fashion mass production vision of fashion either. So it's all those in-betweeners, if you like myself, who are, it's kind of a double whammy, because you're invisible because of your role, even though it's important, but you're also invisible because you're a certain age. So yeah.
Saoirse.
Oh yeah, I'm just going to give you individually a couple of possible references that you might find interesting. Theresa, you might find, because you asked about whether there's non-cisgender conceptualizations of menopause, Paul B. Preciado, and particularly their book Testo Junkie. With Amna, you were talking about the disgusting way that we other migrants, you might find Just Beaupoir's work interesting, and particularly when they talk about exceptionality. And it was written all the way through the English press's orientation towards the Football World Cup, that Saudi Arabians are homophobic, ignoring that, of course, homophobia is rife in the UK.
That's correct.
But you also might find there's a lot of stuff about, all of you are talking, pretty much always talking about Judith Butler, but as an alternative, when you're talking about borders and bodies, Ettinger's work on the matrixial border space, which is deeply psychoanalytic. So it's something you might not want to go towards, but it's there as a possibility. But for all of you, there was a lot of discussion about temporal spatiality and what you're doing. There is potentially this argument that in European and American academic theory, we spatialize time, and bodies then become what stand out from time rather than endure through time. When we talk about Butler and performativity, bodies are what endure through time. The difficulty becomes within the normalization. It's what Ian Hacken starts to talk about, where we have to categorize because we scientificize everything that we do, and the only way we understand is to categorize, and we have to then make bodies stand out from the flow of time as something that we endure. And it goes back to what Vickie is talking about of different concepts of time. And apart from trip theory, you also have Sarwer Ahmad in queer theory, talking about the way queer bodies don't fit straight space. But earlier than that, you had Henri Bergson talking about time is what we also endure through and what erodes our bodies. He didn't say erodes, that's me chucking it in. But he talked about time as being what we endure through. And similar to what Vickie was saying about the different ways we experience time, you have to, I mean, hopefully everyone experiences the idea of if you fall in love with someone and you are separated from them, every passing second is a lifetime.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Thank you, Saoirse. Thank you to our audience, and big thank you to our speakers and wonderful PhD researchers. This has been a treat. Can I please ask you for a big round of applause for our wonderful researchers? Thank you.